Here is the script paraphrased, with the word order and sentence structure adjusted while keeping the same voice, pacing, and tone. There are places that don't appear on any map, not because no one has ever walked there, but because those who did either came back, changed, or didn't come back at all. So, over time, the map makers learned to leave those squares empty. This is one of those stories. But before I begin, let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight. Which county? Which town? Which valley? I read every single one. On a night like this, it's good to know who's out there. And a quick note before we truly begin. If this is the kind of story you'd want to hear more of, I've gathered 10 of them into an audiobook called The Hollow Files. 5 hours, 10 counties. The same voice you're listening to now. The link is in the description and pinned at the top of the comments. Now then, the story. It starts in the spring of 1923, in the far western reach of a county I won't name, because the family that still lives there asked me not to. They still farm the same hollow. They still tell their own version of this tale on their porches in the summer. And I owe them the kindness of leaving the maps alone. A man named Wycliffe Garner, 36 years old, was hired that April by a small outfit called the Cumberland Land and Timber Company. Wycliffe was a surveyor. 6'1", lean through the shoulders the way men do when they've spent years walking and not enough years sitting. His hair was a brown so dark it looked black in any light dimmer than noon. He kept it cropped short under a flat, brimmed hat his father had given him before the war. His hands were narrow, almost a clerk's hands, except for the knuckles, which were thick from carrying a transit and a chain for 11 seasons through country that didn't want him in it. He was a quiet man. He listened more than he spoke. He had been at the Argonne in 1918, and like so many who came back from over there, he returned with a slower way of moving and a habit of checking a room before he stepped into it. Cumberland Land and Timber had bought a tract of forest sight unseen from an estate in Knoxville, 800 acres. The deed was old. The descriptions on it were older. Witness trees that had probably been firewood for 2 generations. A creek the deed called Panel's Branch, but that nobody in the nearest town had ever heard called by that name. Wycliffe's job was to walk the perimeter, mark it fresh, and report back on what was on the land. He was told there'd be nothing up there but second growth and maybe an old hunter's camp. He was told this by a man named Edward Pendrith, who sat behind a desk in a small office on the 2nd floor of a brick building in Knoxville, and never once, in their entire conversation, looked Wycliffe in the eye. Pendrith had a habit of straightening papers that were already straight. He had a slight tremor in his left hand that he held against the edge of the desk to keep still. He paid Wycliffe in advance, the full sum in cash, counted out twice. Wycliffe didn't like that. In his experience, men paid in advance only when they weren't sure the work would be finished, or when they weren't sure the worker would come back to be paid. But the money was real and the work was honest, and his sister Vera was a widow in Asheville with a leaking roof and not much else. So Wycliffe took the train as far as it ran, hired a wagon as far as that ran, and walked the last 12 miles into the hills with a pack, a compass, his transit folded down, and a length of survey chain coiled at his hip. The hills there are old. Not picturesque the way painters paint the Smokies. Tired, worn down to the bone of themselves. The ridges run more or less north and south, with hollows between them, where the mist gathers in the early hours, and won't be hurried out by the sun. The trees are mostly oak and hickory at the top, with hemlock and rhododendron crowding the streams below. In April, the ramps are up, the early dogwoods and the redbud are blooming. And there's a quality to the light up there, that I don't know how to describe. It feels like it's already been seen by someone else and is on its way back to them. Wycliffe set his first camp on the night of the second day on a low bench above a creek he was reasonably sure was the one the deed called Panel's Branch. He was tired. He'd seen no people for a day and a half. He'd seen a black bear and her two cubs at a distance, which he took as a good sign, and the spoor of something larger he didn't care to identify, which he took as a sign to keep his fire going past dark. He ate cold corn pone and a strip of jerked beef, drank coffee thick enough to stand a spoon in, and slept the way a tired man sleeps. Which is to say, not as well as he meant to. In the morning he found a footprint at the edge of his camp. A boot print, recent, smaller than his own, pointed toward his bedroll, not away from it. He hadn't heard a thing in the night. While he made his coffee, he told himself the print could have been there before he set up. He told himself a lot of things on that walk back to the fire. But none of those things stayed told. He kept looking back over his shoulder, the way a horse does when it doesn't trust the ground behind it. On the morning of the fourth day, he found the cabin. It sat in a little flat place in the curve of a creek, in the lee of a ridge, in a stand of hemlock so old the lower branches had given up trying to make leaves. The clearing wasn't natural. Someone had cut it once, and the trees had been allowed to grow back only so far. The way a yard goes back to wild, but never quite forgets it was a yard. The cabin itself was small, about 16 feet on a side, squared logs dovetailed at the corners, chinked with what looked like fresh clay over older clay still. The roof was hand, split shakes weathered to a soft gray. A riverstone chimney climbed up one wall. A clean iron stovepipe came up through the roof on the other side, which puzzled him, because a stone chimney would have done the job for any reasonable cabin. But what stopped him in the clearing was the doors. The cabin had 7 of them. Not 7 walls. 4 walls. One door on the wall facing him, another a little to the left set into the same wall, 2 on the wall to his right. He walked the cabin slowly, keeping the chain loose at his hip, the way a man keeps a hand near his knife without making a show of it. 2 more doors on the wall, opposite the one he'd first approached. 1 on the wall to his left. 7 doors. All of them solid. All of them with iron strap hinges hand-forged. The kind of country blacksmith makes when he's bored on a winter afternoon. All of them with simple wooden latches on the outside. None of them had locks. Now, I've seen old Smoky's cabins with 2 doors for through traffic. I've seen spring houses with low doors for the cool and high doors for storage above. But what I haven't seen, and what Wycliffe Garner hadn't seen either, was 7 doors on a 1-room cabin in country that, according to every map in Edward Pendrith's office, was uninhabited. He stood there a long time listening. The hemlocks made no sound. There wasn't any wind to speak of. He could hear the creek low and steady behind him. But he could not hear birds. He realized this slowly, the way a man realizes a tooth has gone bad. The absence settled in. He turned a slow circle. Nothing was wrong, exactly. But nothing was right either. He chose the door on the wall facing him, because that's the door a man chooses when he doesn't know better. He lifted the latch. It opened easily, without a sound. The room inside was one room, just the one. Plank floor swept clean. A Reverstone fireplace on his left with cold ash in the grate, and 3 split logs stacked beside it. A small cook stove against the far wall with the stovepipe rising straight up. A bed in the corner to his right, narrow with a quilt folded neat at the foot. A wash basin on a stand. A shelf above it with a tin cup, a razor, and a small pewter mirror. And in the center of the room, a table. The table was long. Longer than the room had any business holding. It ran almost the full length of the floor, and it was set for six. 6 places. 6 pewter plates, 6 pewter cups, 6 knives, 6 forks, 6 spoons laid out neat. A salt cellar in the middle. A pitcher beside it empty, the inside dry as paper. No food. He stood in the open doorway with his hand still on the latch, and from the inside he counted the doors. 7. 7 doors from the inside, all of them in the 4 walls of the same single room. He could see the door he had just opened, standing wide behind him with daylight pouring through. He could see the other 6 closed, latched on the inside this time with simple wooden buttons. The math wasn't right. You understand. The math wasn't right. He took a slow step back into the clearing and counted again from outside. 7. He went around the cabin once more, slowly touching each door as he passed it. 7 on 4 walls. He went back in. 7 from the inside. He stayed in the clearing for an hour after that, just sitting on a stump near the creek, smoking, doing the arithmetic on a page of his field book over and over in different ways, trying to find the trick. He was a surveyor. He measured things for a living. He knew the difference between what walls could and could not do. He couldn't find the trick. Eventually, because hunger is a steadier thing than fear, he ate. Then, because he was paid to do a job, he went back inside to look at the rest of it. That's when he found the ledger. It sat at the head of the long table in the place where the host would sit if the host had ever come. A book. Leather, bound, the leather cracked but supple, the way leather is when it's been kept oiled by careful hands. He opened it at the front. The first entry was dated April the 9th, 1827. Almost 100 years to the day before he was standing there reading it. The handwriting was an old hand, Long says, the kind of looping capital letters nobody bothered with anymore. The entry read simply, "Arrived this morning." The way was longer than I had been told. The host has set the table. I will stay until the rain breaks. Below that was a signature he couldn't quite read. Something like Reuben with a surname that began with a P. He turned the page. Another entry in a different hand. June 1828. Took shelter from a black storm. There is bread and salt on the table, though I did not bring them. I cannot find the man who keeps this place, but he keeps it well. Signed by a woman, a Mrs. M.T. Colwine. He turned the page. He kept turning. There were hundreds of entries. He didn't count them, but later, thinking back, he believed there must have been 300 or 400. They covered the better part of a century. They were in different hands, in different inks, on paper that had been added to the book at different times. Some entries were a single line, some ran for a page or more, and not one of them mentioned a departure. That's what stopped him. He'd been reading idly at first, the way a man reads a guest book at a country inn. Then he'd started looking for a pattern. Then he'd started looking for what wasn't there. Nobody left. Every entry was an arrival. A peddler in the autumn of 1841 complained about the cold and the lack of feed for his mule. Signed his name, said he would stay a day or two. There was no follow-up entry from him. There was no entry from anyone else mentioning his mule. A circuit riding preacher in the spring of 1860 wrote a long, anxious entry about the war he could feel coming and asked God to keep the cabin safe. He signed himself Pastor Ode K. Linscomb. Pastor Linscomb did not write a second entry. A country doctor named Criswell Doyne in 1876 wrote that he had been called out to a sick farmer and had lost his way in fog and had found the cabin instead and was glad of it. He intended to leave at first light. He did not, so far as the book recorded, leave at first light. This is the kind of thing where a reasonable man does one of two things. He either closes the book and walks out, or he keeps reading until he finds the entry that makes him close the book and run. Wycliffe Garner kept reading. He read the 80s, the 90s, the turn of the century. The handwriting changed, the grammar changed, the paper changed. By 1910 or so, the entries were in cheap fountain pen on lined sheets pasted into the book by some patient hand. The names changed. The pattern did not. Nobody left. He read an entry from a woman in 1914 who said she had walked up from the railhead at her uncle's suggestion to take the mountain air for her nerves. She wrote her name in a neat schoolteacher's hand, Miss Lena Whatley. There was no second entry from Miss Whatley. He read an entry from a man in 1919 who said he had been walking home from the war and had got himself turned around in the hollows and had been grateful to find a roof. He wrote that he would push on in the morning. He had not written again. The entries had been growing further apart by that point. Fewer of them. Months or years between, as if the cabin were a thing the world was forgetting. And then, 18 pages from the end of the book, he found the entry from last October, 1922. It read, "I was sent up here by a man in Knoxville named Pendrith. He paid me in advance, which I did not like. I have walked 4 days. The cabin is just as the others described it. I will stay one night and then leave at first light." It was signed. It was signed Wycliffe Garner. The handwriting was his. He sat in the host's chair at the head of the long table, with the ledger open in front of him, and he looked at his own signature on a page in a book that should not have known his name, in an entry dated 6 months before he had ever heard of Cumberland Land and Timber. He hadn't been here. He had never been here. He had not written that. He'd never written that. He read the entry again, in case the handwriting was someone else's that only resembled his own. It wasn't. The way he made his W's was particular to him. He developed it as a young man, because his father had teased him about his lazy capitals, and he'd practiced for a month, in the army, in the trenches at Argonne, until the W came out the way he wanted it. Crisp. Sharp at the top, the right leg longer than the left. Nobody else made a W that way. He had asked once in his life, half joking, of a fellow surveyor whether anyone could forge his W. The man had laughed and said only Wycliffe Garner himself could forge a Wycliffe Garner W. He flipped forward page by page. There were 6 more entries after his. One was from a man named Pratt, no first name given, who said he was looking for his brother. November 1922. The handwriting was shaky. The next was from a woman who only signed herself J in January of 1923. She said the snow was deep and the host had laid in extra wood. She thanked him. The next 3 were undated. They were in 3 different hands. The third was nearly illegible, the way a tired man's writing goes loose at the wrist. The last entry in the book was a single line. In his own hand again, dated 2 days from the day he was sitting there reading it. It read, "I have decided to stay." He shut the book. He shut it slowly. He set it down. He stood up from the host's chair. He looked once around the room at the cold ash in the grate, at the 6 pewter plates, at the made bed, and then he walked calmly, the way a man walks who doesn't want to admit he's running, out of the door he'd come in by, across the clearing, and into the trees. He walked for an hour downstream, the way he'd come. At the end of that hour, he stepped out of the hemlocks into a clearing in the curve of a creek, in the lee of a ridge, with 7 doors on its 4 walls, a chimney of river stone, and a stovepipe straight up through the roof. He stood at the edge of the trees and looked at the cabin. He counted the doors. He looked behind him at the path he'd come down. He looked at the sun, which was where it ought to be given the time. He looked at his compass. The compass agreed with the sun. He'd walked an hour downstream, and he was back where he'd started. A reasonable man does one of 2 things. Wycliffe Garner sat down at the edge of the trees with his back against a hemlock and laughed. Not the kind of laugh that means a thing is funny. The kind a man uses when there isn't anything else handy. He laughed for about a minute, and then he stopped, and then he made himself a smoke and thought it through. He tried again an hour later. A different direction. Northwest along the ridge, contouring the way you do in country like that. He held a steady pace for 2 hours. At the end of the 2 hours, he came down off the ridge into a clearing in the curve of a creek. And there were 7 doors. He tried a third time the next morning, after spending an uneasy night, at the edge of the clearing without going inside. He had decided the cabin was the trouble, and the trouble would let him be if he kept clear of it. He slept on and off with his back against a hemlock and his hand on his hatchet, and twice in the night he woke with the unshakable feeling that someone had just walked past him, very close on quiet feet. In the morning he tried due south. He paced his steps. He marked trees with his hatchet the way a surveyor does, blazing the bark white. He counted blazes. He passed 80, 3 blazes on the way out, and then he came down into the clearing with the cabin in front of him, and when he turned to check the trees, the blazes on his back trail were gone. The bark was clean. He sat down again in the clearing, this time on the front step of the cabin, and he was no longer laughing. He'd been in the army. He'd been at Argonne. He knew the difference between fear and panic. And he knew that the moment you let panic in, it eats your judgment first and your strength after. He sat on the step and breathed slow and thought. He thought about the entry he had written in the future in a hand. He could not mistake. I have decided to stay. He had not decided to stay. He was going to be very careful. He decided not to decide it. It was late in the afternoon by then. He went down to the creek and washed his face. He filled his canteen. He came back up the bank and saw a man sitting on the front step of the cabin in the place he had just left. The man hadn't been there a minute before. He was small, maybe 5'4", in old wool trousers and a wool coat that had been a good coat about 30 years ago. He had a peddler's pack at his feet, the wooden frame patched and rebuilt and patched again. His face was a face Wycliffe couldn't put an age on. Not old, not young. The eyes were pale. The hair under the brimmed hat was the gray of pencil lead. Evening, the man said. Wycliffe stood at the bottom of the step. Evening didn't mean to startle you. You didn't. I did. But it's polite of you to say. Wycliffe waited. The peddler did not seem inclined to fill the silence, which Wycliffe respected, because in his experience, the men who try to fill silences are the men who are lying. After a long minute, Wycliffe said, "What's your name, friend?" "Vetch," the peddler said. "Milan Vetch." Pleased. "Wycliffe Garner." "I know." There was the smallest pause. "You've been reading the book," Malon said. "I have." "Then you know." "I'm not sure what I know." Milan Vetch laughed a soft laugh like dry leaves. He stood up from the step, picked up his pack, and gestured at the door behind him. "Come in. I'll put the kettle on. Wood's already laid. You've been a long day." Wycliffe didn't move. "I won't shut the door behind you," Malon said. "You can sit by it. You've been here before. Many times. You've been here long this time." Milan Vetch considered the question the way a man considers a tricky bit of weather. "Hard to say," he said at last. "Time's not even here. Could be a week, could be longer. I've stopped keeping track. It's bad for the digestion." Wycliffe didn't go in just then. He sat down on a log at the edge of the clearing, where he could see the open doorway, and he watched Milan Vetch lay a fire in the stove and put a kettle on. The peddler moved like a man in his own kitchen. He knew where the matches were. He knew which board creaked. He fetched 2 tin cups from the shelf without looking at the shelf. After a while, with the kettle just about to whistle. Milan came to the doorway and looked out and said, "You may as well come in, son. The tea won't hurt you. The cabin won't either. The cabin doesn't hurt anyone. That's the trouble with it." Wycliffe came in. He left the door open behind him, and he sat near it on the bench against the wall, and he kept his pack on the floor between his boots, and he accepted the tea, which was sassafras, and something else he didn't recognize. And he drank it because Malon drank it first. They talked for a long while. Malon Vetch told Wycliffe Garner what he knew about the cabin, and what he didn't, and what he had stopped trying to know. He had first come to the cabin, he said, as a young peddler on his second route through the hills in 1846. He had been caught in a hard rain, and had stumbled into the clearing, and had been very grateful for the roof, and the fire already laid in the grate. He had stayed one night. He had left in the morning. The cabin had let him go that first time, he said, the way it sometimes lets people go. He had come back. He didn't know why. 4 years later, and again 8 years after that, and again. The intervals had got shorter, and then longer, and then the dates had got tangled in his head until he didn't entirely know anymore which time it was. He had bought his pack new in 1839. He had rebuilt it 4 times. He still bought goods in towns at the foot of the hills, and he still sold them at farms in the hollows. And the farms didn't seem to have changed much, although the people in them had. Wycliffe asked him how old he was. Milan Vetch said he didn't know anymore. He said he had stopped counting when he realized the count was wrong. He said he was somewhere between 120 and 140, depending on how you measured. He said he didn't feel a day over 50 except in the knees. He said it without any heat. The way a man tells you what's in his almanac. Wycliffe Garner did not believe him. Wycliffe Garner did not entirely disbelieve him. The strangeness of the situation was beginning to take effect. He could feel a kind of slow softening of the edges of things. Not from the tea. He'd watched Milan pour it. But from the cabin itself. From the patience of it. He asked Milan about the ledger. Milan said the ledger had been there, as long as he had been coming. He didn't know who had started it. He didn't know who added the new pages. He had written in it himself 11 times. He had stopped writing in it after the 11th, because he had realized after the 11th that the entries were not records. What are they then? Wycliffe said. Invitations, said Milan Vetch. Offers to what? To stay. Wycliffe set down his cup. Milan went on quietly. The way you go on when you don't want to be overheard. Although there was no one else in the room, and no one else for miles. He said the cabin did not take people. He said the cabin offered. He said the entries in the book that had no departure beneath them were not the entries of people who had died. They were the entries of people who had read their own future entry. The one that said they had decided to stay, and who had, in the end, decided to stay. And the ones who left, Wycliffe said. What about them? There aren't many, but there are some. How did they leave? Milan Vetch took a long while to answer. He looked into his tea. He looked at the open door. He looked at Wycliffe, and his pale eyes were not unkind, but they were old. They wrote a letter, he said. Every one of them that I know of wrote a letter. They sat at the head of the table where the host sits, and they wrote a letter to somebody they loved, and they put the letter on the table between the plates, and they walked out the door they'd come in by, and they kept walking, and they got out. Most of them did. And the ones who didn't wrote another entry later, sometimes much later. Wycliffe sat with that for a while. He sat with it the way a man sits with a thing he doesn't want to believe, but already knows he does. He looked at the 6 pewter plates on the long table. He looked at the salt cellar in the middle. He looked at the host's chair empty at the head where he had sat to read the book. "Why a letter?" he said after a long while. Malone Vetch sipped his tea and thought about it. "I have a theory," he said. "It's only mine. I've had a long time to make it. The way I figure it, the cabin doesn't want people. It wants the going. It wants the leaving. It wants the wanting to leave. A man who will walk out without a word, who will go like he's running from a depth, doesn't leave anything behind. The cabin needs you to leave something behind. The letter is what you leave to prove I was here. Maybe just to prove there's somebody out there you'd rather be with than the host at this table. The cabin doesn't argue with that. The cabin only argues with you when you can't think of anyone." Wycliffe Garner thought about that, too. He thought about his sister Vera in Asheville with her leaking roof and her dead husband and the small bookkeeping job she had taken at the lumberyard that didn't pay enough to fix the roof. He thought about the field book in his pack and the contracts in it, and the cash from Edward Pendrith that was now hidden behind a stone in his sister's garden in case the train was robbed, and the way his sister had stood at the door when he left, with her hand on the doorframe, and had said, "Be careful, Wick. Be the careful one, not the brave one." He thought about who he would write a letter to. It was, of course, Vera. It was, of course, only Vera. He thought about what he would write. That night, he slept in the cabin on the bench by the open door with his head on his pack and his hatchet under his hand. Malone Vetch slept in the bed in the corner. Malone Vetch snored the way a man snores who has slept in many strange places, easily and without shame. Wycliffe did not sleep well. He dreamed of the table set for 6. In his dream, the 6 places had been filled. 6 people sat at the table eating something he could not see clearly. One of them was a woman in a long skirt of a fashion 70 years out of date. One of them was a man in a Confederate kepi. One of them was a country doctor with a black bag at his feet. One of them, at the foot of the table, was Malone Vetch. The seat at the head, where the host would have sat, was empty. The seat to the host's right, the place of honor, was the place that had been set for him. He woke before dawn with a feeling in his chest like cold water rising in a well. The fire had burned down to coals. The stove was warm, but not hot. Malone Vetch was sitting up in the bed, fully dressed, smoking his pipe. "You all right?" "Son, I'm all right." "You going to do it today?" "I'm going to do it today." "You'll need pen and ink." "The pen and ink's in the drawer of the table. It's always there."
"All right. And son?"
"Yes. When you walk out, don't look back." "All right. I mean it." I knew a man once who walked out the door. He'd come in by with his letter on the table and got most of the way to the creek and looked back. "He's been here ever since." Wycliffe said, "All right." He got up. He washed his face in the cold water in the basin. He put on his coat. He sat down at the host's chair at the head of the table, and he opened the drawer he had not noticed in the daylight. The pen was a steel nib pen, the kind a clerk uses. The ink was in a small glass bottle. The paper was good paper, heavier than the paper in the ledger, with a faint blue ruling. He sat for a long time with the pen in his hand. Then he wrote. He wrote to Vera. He told her he was well. He told her he loved her, a thing he had not said to her since their mother had died 19 years before. And even then, he had only mouthed the words at the back of the church, where she had seen him say them. He told her he had been hired to survey a piece of ground in country that didn't want surveying, and that he had found the country was right, and that he was coming home, and that the money behind the stone in her garden was hers. All of it. And not to be ashamed to use it. He told her he had met a man named Vetch in the hills, and that if a peddler ever came to her door selling tin and ribbon and small good things, and his eyes were pale, and his hair the color of pencil lead, she should buy a thing from him out of kindness, and ask after Wycliffe Garner, who had once shared his tea. He did not tell her about the cabin. He could not, he found, write the words. He signed the letter and folded it once and set it on the table between the pewter plates. He stood up. He looked at the ledger at the head of the table, and he did not open it. He took his pack and his hatchet and his transit. He put on his hat. He walked to the door he had come in by. Vetch was sitting on the bed smoking his pipe, and the smoke went up in a slow gray line in the lamplight. "Good luck, son." "Thank you, Mr. Vetch. Don't look back." "I won't." He opened the door. The air outside was the still air of the moment before sunrise, when the birds, if there had been birds, would have been about to start. He walked across the clearing to the creek. He waded the creek. Although there was a log he could have used, he didn't trust the log to take him anywhere. He waded it in his boots, and the cold of the water came up around his shins and into his bones. He walked up the far bank. He walked into the trees. He did not look back. He walked for an hour. He kept the rising sun to his right, which would, if the ridges still ran the way the ridges had always run, take him north toward the head of the watershed where the logging road came in. He did not look back. He did not look back when he heard something behind him that might have been a footstep and was probably a deer. He did not look back when, after the second hour, he had the very distinct feeling that someone was walking just behind his left shoulder in step with him, breathing easily. He did not look back. There was a moment, 3 hours in, when the trail he was on dropped down into a low place between two ridges, and the mist was thick in the low place, and he could see in the mist the faint glow of a window. A square of yellow light, a lamp in a window. He could smell in the mist the smoke of a stove. He could hear very faintly the creak of a kettle on iron. He did not stop. He did not slow. He walked through the smell of the stove, and the glow of the window, and the creak of the kettle. And after he was through, he could not have said for sure that any of it had been there. He walked until midday. He had not eaten. He didn't trust the food in his pack. And he didn't trust the food in the cabin behind him. And he didn't trust himself to stop walking once he had stopped. He walked through the morning and into the afternoon, and his right hip began to ache, and his left boot began to rub through his sock, and his mouth went dry, and the dryness in his mouth was the most ordinary, the most human thing he had felt in 3 days. He clung to it. At the height of the afternoon, with the sun starting its long fall toward the western ridge, he came down off a slope onto a graded road, a logging road. There were wagon tracks in it, fresh ones. He stood at the edge of the road for a long minute looking at those wagon tracks. He looked up the road and down the road. He took a step onto it. He put his weight down. The road took his weight. He walked north. 3 miles up the road, in a clearing that smelled of wood smoke and cut pine and sweat, he came up on a logging camp, men in canvas trousers splitting rails, a team of mules, a camp boss with a stub of pencil behind his ear, who looked up when Wycliffe Garner walked into the clearing and squinted at him for a long moment, and then said, in a voice that was puzzled, "Mister, you all right? You look like you've been to a funeral." Wycliffe Garner said, "I've been surveying out there." "Yeah." The camp boss looked past him at the ridge he'd come over. "Ain't nothing back that way. Old burnt ground. Hasn't been a man passed here in 12 years. Wycliffe said, "Has anyone come up this road in the last hour?" The camp boss said, "No." Wycliffe Garner sat down on a stump and ate a bowl of beans that one of the loggers, a man named Cleve Riskin, brought him without being asked. And he drank a tin cup of coffee, and he did not say anything else about where he had been. He rode out of the camp the next morning on the back of a supply wagon. He rode to the railhead. He took the train to Knoxville. In Knoxville, he went to the office of Cumberland Land and Timber. There was no office of Cumberland Land and Timber. The building was there. The door, he remembered, was there. The brass plate had been changed. The new tenant was a dentist named Halliburton, who was puzzled by Wycliffe's question and a little alarmed by his face. Halliburton said he had been in the building for 9 years. He said no land and timber company had ever rented from him. He said he didn't know anyone named Pendrith. Wycliffe Garner went to the county clerk. The county clerk had no record of an Edward Pendrith. The county clerk had no record of an 1-800-acre tract being sold by an estate to a Cumberland Land and Timber Company. The county clerk did have a record of an old tract, 1-800 acres, in that county, in roughly the right place. The deed had last been recorded in 1824. The owner was listed as Pannell. No first name given. The deed had never been transferred. Pannell had no heirs. The land, the clerk said, was effectively no one's. The county had been meaning to do something about it for 60 years and had never gotten around to it. Wycliffe Garner thanked the county clerk and walked out of the courthouse. And he sat on the courthouse steps for a long while, and he watched the people of Knoxville walk past with their ordinary errands and their ordinary faces. And he did not look like one of them anymore. He went home to Asheville. He gave his sister Vera the money, and he did not tell her until much later where it had come from. He fixed the roof himself. He took a job with the city, surveying lots for the new houses going up on the south side. He never again took a contract in the back country. He never again carried his transit into the hills. Some years later, in the late 1920s, a peddler came to Vera's door. He was a small man. He had pale eyes. His hair was the color of pencil lead. He sold her a tin of needles and a length of blue ribbon. And as he was packing up his case, she said, on a whim she didn't quite understand, "Did you ever know a Wycliffe Garner?" The peddler looked up at her. He looked at her for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then he smiled, a small, kind smile, and he said, "Once, ma'am, we shared a tea." She brought him into the kitchen and poured him a coffee and made him a sandwich. He stayed an hour. He did not say much about her brother. He said that Wycliffe Garner had been a careful man and a good one, and that the world had more use for careful men than it knew. He said he was glad to hear that Wycliffe was well. He thanked her for the coffee. He left. She told Wycliffe that evening about the peddler. Wycliffe Garner did not say anything for a long time. Then he asked her to describe his eyes again. She described them. He nodded. He went out onto the back porch, and he stood there for a while in the dark smoking. And Vera, watching him through the kitchen window, thought that her brother looked just then like a man saying goodbye to someone she could not see. He lived to be 73. He died in his bed in 1960 of a heart that had grown tired the way all hearts grow tired. He left his papers to his sister, who outlived him by 4 years. Among his papers, Vera found a small leather-bound book in his hand in which he had written, every year on the 9th of April, a single line. The first line, dated 1924, read, "Did not look back." The second, dated 1925, read, "Did not look back." There were 37 lines. The last one was dated April the 9th, 1960. He had died on the 12th. The last line read, "Did not look back. Will not look back." Vera Garner kept the little book for the rest of her life, and she never showed it to anyone. And when she died, her great-niece found it in a drawer and didn't know what it meant. The land is still there. It still belongs to no one. The county has, as far as I know, still not done anything about it. The logging road has long since grown over. The creek the deed called Panel's Branch still runs. I was told by the man who told me this story that he had walked the back of that county once in the late summer of 1979, looking for a deer he had wounded. He had walked further than he meant to. He had crossed a ridge he did not recognize. He had come down into a clearing he did not recognize, in the curve of a creek, in the lee of a ridge, where he stopped at the edge of the trees and counted, on a building he did not enter, 7 doors. He turned around. He climbed the ridge. He did not look back. He told me he doesn't go into the back country anymore. He told me he buys his deer at the meat counter at the IGA and pretends he hunted it. He told me his wife teases him for it. He told me he doesn't mind being teased. I will say this. If you ever go walking in those old hills in the spring of a year, in country that's gone back to wild, and the birds go quiet, and you come down off a ridge into a flat place in the curve of a creek, and see a small squared log cabin with a chimney of riverstone and a stovepipe straight up through the roof. Do me one favor. Count the doors. If there are 7, leave. Walk back the way you came. Don't go in. And if you should find that you have already gone in, and the kettle is on, and a small man with pale eyes has poured you a tea, and the ledger is open on the table, and a pen is in your hand, then this is what I would say to you, although I cannot promise it will help. Write the letter. Write it to whoever it is you love. Walk out the door you came in by, and don't look back. Wycliffe Garner kept his promise for 37 years. He never looked back. He never went into the hills. He never spoke of what he had seen. But late in his life, after Vera had outlived him by a few months and begun her own slow forgetting, she told a friend that sometimes, on certain spring nights, when the wind moved a particular way, through the apple tree behind the house, she would smell very faintly the smoke of an old wood stove, a stove she did not own, a stove that was not in her kitchen, a stove burning somewhere far back in country she had never seen. She would stand in the dark of her back porch, with the smell on the wind, and she would think of her brother. And she would think of the small peddler with the pale eyes, who had once sold her a length of blue ribbon. And she would not herself look back. She would only go inside and shut the door and put on the kettle and sit at her own table and wait for the smell to pass. It always did. It always does. If you've stayed with me this long, thank you. And tell me in the comments the strangest place you've ever found in the woods. The one you didn't quite have words for when you got home. The one you've never been back to. I read them all. I always do. If a similar story has ever happened to someone in your family, share it with us. It might become our next telling. And if this is the kind of story you'd want more of, the Hollow Files audiobook is in the description and pinned in the comments. 10 of them. 5 hours. The same kind of quiet trouble. Stay with us for the next account. Until next time, be the careful one.